Don't forget to check my check my webpage. That's why I have the weekly calendar, even though it's open to revision because things change. I just said gaffes. But I have reading assignments, links to the YouTube page, all of that, and on Teams every day. That's what I do it the night before usually. But I'll post what we're doing on that day, any assignments that are due every day, and that's also the link to the webpage and all of that. And so, just reminding you, do those things. I don't know what other teachers do. I know everyone has a different procedure, but I try to be as consistent as possible. And we're up and running. All right. So, I actually put up the history of Rome PowerPoint I had to make for Western Civ. One of the things I do PowerPoint and then I write stuff on the board, but because we have to do this online, I do everything on PowerPoint. And, yeah, the parts of it are good. I like showing the pictures, but the parts of it I don't like. What was the compromise? That's in 3630 and Missouri Estate, Maine Estate. Missouri Compromise. And what territory? 3630, no slave coast north of 3630, it applied to what territory? What purchase? What territory? Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase. And so with that, we have this. What was the idea that spread slavery out and eventually it'll go away? What was that called? Diffusion. And so we talked about that. Talmadge Amendment said what kind of emancipation when they reach a certain age? What was that called? The emancipation, which means freeing the slaves. Yeah, post-Navy. And, 5 people ran for president in 1824. One bailed out and became the vice president. But the election really came down to what 2 people? What 2 people? Jackson and Adams. John Quincy Adams. Who looks like a what in this picture? Angry salamander, correct? Angry salamander. So this is right where we quit. Did we get to this where we had Jackson won or had more electoral votes, but didn't have a majority? That's where popular votes actually mattered. But remember, it's people within the states who can vote, which most people couldn't vote. They picked the electors. Jackson had more popular votes, but remember, popular votes don't matter. Nobody won the Electoral College. It goes to where? If nobody won? The House. But every state has an equal vote. And what did Jackson call? Okay, I told you anyways, the corrupt bargain. And that's where I think, didn't we just, right when the bell rang, Henry Clay threw its support to John Quincy Adams because of that American system. Adams wins House. And every president except for Adams, John Adams, the first Adams, have been Secretary of State. And so Jackson said this was a corrupt bargain. This would begin the divide. There was an element of deal making. Was it corrupt? Why wouldn't Clay support Adams? And so there's John Quincy Adams. And Adams proposed the American system. Rhodes wanted to strengthen the bank. He wanted a higher tariff. He basically did this. He also, there was a real push to remove American Indians who were living here, those who had been defeated at Horseshoe Bend, move them westward. And Adams resisted this. Now, some people have said that he resisted it, and I think there's an element of both here. He resisted this because he wanted better treatment of American Indians who had survived disease and war. But also, he didn't want those states to become stronger states in support of his opposition. There were political reasons too. I think it's a combination. But his presidency would be deemed a failure because of opposition of pro-Jackson supporters in the South and the West. So that's when we get to the election of 1828. And this election would be a bitter, divisive, mean-spirited election. I'm just making sure we are recording. We are recording. All is well. All is well that ends well. Here's another picture, Jackson and Adams, and look at it carefully, right? You agree? Right? It's basically the same thing. That's a good looking salamander. You got to give me that. What?
You're acting like you put up two different pictures.
Yeah, just a different. He just posed differently. Yeah, Adam Salamander, the same thing. And nasty campaign where both resorted to personal attacks on each other. They're still technically Republicans. They're still technically Republicans. But Jackson was moving away. In fact, this is a little bit of a combination of the attacks. Here, they're accusing Jackson of a murderous commander who had soldiers executed for cowardice after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which, yeah, a lot of generals did this. This was the norm, but Jackson did. And so I think this is a very clever use of coffins to show this. And here is Jackson, man of the people, derived from the people, for you, Old Hickory. And here's Jackson hanging John Quincy Adams. So they're pretty brutal here. Once again, that gets back to the point. If you think campaigns today are brutal, wow. They were always brutal. But here's a big thing that happened. During the campaign, no, this is nothing like a modern campaign. Candidates did not campaign for themselves. They did it through newspapers and surrogates, and they're trying to influence states. I guess it's kind of like today a little bit. But in the House, there is a proposal to double the 1816 tariff. The 1816 tariff was 25%. Double it in some, not everything, so it's complex, but a generic doubling up to 50%. And this was a trick by supporters of Jackson, who are more and more calling themselves the democracy or democratic. So everyone got this. This was a trick by supporters of Jackson. So it's not enough to put democratic trick. Make sure you know that. Supporters of Jackson. They were calling themselves Democratic Republicans, saying that we're the real party of Jefferson. So here's the trick. Adams said for 3 years he supports a tariff, but not a tariff that high. If he goes against it, Democrats thought he'll look like a hypocrite. If he votes for it, Democrats could say, he's doubling prices, he's raising your taxes. It was a trick. It was a pretty ham-handed trick, and the big industry was textiles. And this shows tariff. This is the tariff. Some of the rates actually went up to over 60% on textiles. For steel, the 40%. So that means a 60% tax. And who pays tariffs? Consumers. Consumers. For example, President Trump, through a bill that says he can do raise tariffs for national defense, raise taxes on goods from China. And who paid higher prices? We did. You would know it if, I'm sure a lot of you bought washers and dryers last year, right? About 2 or 3 washers and dryers.
Oh, yeah.
The prices went up by about 40%. Why? That tariff. Not on everything. Most things, you know, we have no inflation now, but anyways, back to this. It passed, and quickly the Democrats dubbed it the Tariff of Abomination. Like the font. Aren't you scared? That chiller font? Yeah. The Tariff of Abomination. So the Democrats, Jackson supporters, soon to be called Democrats, proposed it. Adams signed it. And then they turned around and said, how dare you sign this horrible tariff? It was a trick, and Adams fell for it. And Adams felt he might not get another chance. Some of his supporters, some of the Capitol, said, yeah, we want the tariff. We'll raise our prices. And this really hurt him. But there was another issue that came about. And it was about Rachel Jackson. Jackson's wife. And Adams really used the class issue. That here you have these lower class people. That commoners were lower class and therefore immoral. People of Jackson's class are immoral. Now let me explain why, what happened here. He's using this to say Rachel Jackson's wife proves that people like Jackson are immoral. This class issue. What was the issue? And I should have. I'm going to change this right now. I'll do it after I. Rachel Jackson was married. Had a horrible marriage, and in fact, she had probably worked in a couple taverns to make a living. Now, taverns, don't think in terms of bars. These were bars, restaurants, hotels. They just call them taverns. And she got divorced. Well, the divorce took a little while, and Jackson married her technically before the divorce document right here was signed by the judge. They thought she was divorced, but she wasn't divorced. So this is a quote from an Adams support. On a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband be placed in the highest office in this free and Christian land. Because she was married technically twice, she was an adulteress. Now, technically, of course, what they're doing is by saying that because Jackson's wife was divorced, she's immoral. She's a tainted woman. And that's the kind of people these lower class individuals like Jackson are. They are immoral. And I can't emphasize this enough. Commoners are common because they're inherently immoral. And can we allow immoral people like Jackson into office? And you can imagine how Jackson took this. He had been attacked for having a wife who was divorced their entire marriage. And they were completely and totally devoted to each other. There's a watercolor of Jackson getting married when they're very young men. Young men and women. But this attack would be used. By the way, that's a common attack against women. Women are immoral if they get divorced. There's something wrong with them. Now, men, that's different. Men can do it. But women, no. And that fits in with this idea of the call to domesticity. Women are supposed to be the moral teachers in society. But this was class. Wealthy, rich people saying Jackson was immoral. This infuriated Jackson, who wanted to strangle every person who said anything wrong or attacked his wife. And his wife, who had been ill for a very long time, went into a tailspin because of the attacks on her. Still, when the election came about, I put the two elections out there. Remember the split election in 1824? Now look at this election. A massive sweep for Jackson. Jackson won every place but the upper Northeast. And you'll notice something else. Look how many more people voted in this election compared to this election. More people are voting. Now remember, for president, they're voting for electors. But this is beginning of a wave of this idea that at least white men, regardless of class, should be allowed to vote. And this is going to be a fight. And people forget what a big deal this was. Such a huge deal that white men could vote. The reason I'm saying this is because this, I don't forget to do it. Yeah, a lot of people could not vote yet. But they still didn't count women. For the most part, women who could vote in some areas up here lost that right because the Industrial Revolution had started. And people who were not white could not vote. Slaves could not vote. A lot of people were kept out of this. But this is still a huge change. So that cannot be discounted. Once you have a country where it's accepted that more and more people who are not rich, who do not have money, can vote, it becomes easier to say, well, then why should we stop at just white men? Why not all men and then all women? It's a slow and awkward stepping stone, but people sometimes forget what a big deal that was. Jackson won a huge sweep. So he called himself Democratic Republicans. John Quincy Adams called them the National Republicans. But this name is actually kind of meaningless. This just shows the split in the Republican Party. His supporters will be called the Democracy, the Democratic Party. John Quincy Adams, his supporters will flail around, then eventually they'll coalesce into a group called the Whigs. So that's what's coming. So let's get to this then. This is a big shift. Here is a ballot though, and I love this ballot. So they would print these out in these new printing presses. So if you were in Ohio and you wanted to vote for Andrew Jackson, and you notice his vice president was the sitting vice president. I'm not going to yell it. Okay, I should. But Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, do you want to see Calhoun one more time? Yeah, I think it's time. We'll show him again, don't worry. He's another one that we can't escape. And don't forget, neck hair. He's Adams's vice president. He would run as Jackson's vice president in 1828, I'm sorry. The sitting vice president for Adams would run as the vice president against Adams. So that would be like Mike Pence running for vice president for Joe Biden now. And it's just as patently ridiculous because Calhoun ran with Jackson because he hated the tariff. He just assumed Jackson would be somebody pliable who he could control and be for the big plantation owners. Wow, was he wrong. 100% wrong. Jackson hated people like Calhoun. But he's looking at you. Look into his eyes, people. So let's get back here. But when you voted, this is in Ohio, you picked up a piece of paper, and you took this paper, and this was the slate of all the electors that were pledged to vote for Jackson. And it's just the county where they're from. They're all pledged. And then you would go and you would put them in a jar. That's who you vote. And they would go through and count the pieces of paper. Okay, this votes for all Calhoun, and then they would count that one. And you voted in front of everybody. And in a state like this, you had to have either paid taxes or had property. So not everyone could vote. And this is what we do now. So when I went and voted for president in Montana, when I voted for just we have winner take all, so it's Biden or Trump, I'm not voting for Biden or Trump. I'm voting for electors pledged. They just don't write them down. Some states still write them down, the electors that are pledged. Part of the reason they don't is because they take too much space. And thus we began a concept of Jacksonian democracy. And this used to be, okay, this was overrated. No, Jacksonian democracy changed everything. And then it was bitterly attacked. And then we brought back again with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, in the 30s and 40s. And then people would like also remember, oh, Jackson did a lot of bad things, and it'd be discounted again. And that's kind of where we're at now. Jacksonian democracy was huge. This changed the way that Americans thought about themselves. A similar thing would happen under FDR. Where here we have thought, the Americans thought of themselves as the people are sovereign, the people have power. Under Franklin Roosevelt would be the middle class has power. That's all of them are up for argument. So here's Jackson defending this capital, defending the people's capital from all the powers that want to rip it apart. And they show the elite as a bunch of dogs. That's how they try to show them. But my favorite part about this is, for some reason, there's a strange gnome-like character riding one of the dogs. I have no idea who the gnome is, but I'm glad he's there to defend me from that gnome. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But it's pretty cool. Did you notice the gnome when he first? Yeah. So what did it mean? Well, the big thing is that land requirements, property requirements begin to go away. And no, Jackson did not go into each state to do this. But Jackson represented this. Jackson represented somebody who will protect regular voters. So here, virtually every state requires some kind of property requirements just for white people. Now, in a way, this is a great thing. But once they started getting rid of property requirements, that made it easier to keep women from voting. Because women who had property, they could say, well, they can vote because they have a vested stake, they have property. Once women vote, they're supposed to be home. But you'll notice how more states went to taxpayer. It's kind of funny, South Carolina had universal white male suffrage, but didn't count the votes. South Carolina is a really funny state. Remember, suffrage means the right to vote. So property requirements began to go away. And voter turnout went up dramatically. Look at the number of eligible voters that voted by 1860. People really felt like they had part of the system. Now, a lot of it became like a club, though. My club's the Democrats. My club's the Whigs. There's a big element of that today. Even though parties are really weak in the United States, there's still this element of, well, I'm a Republican, I vote this way. I'm a Democrat, I vote this way. Parties are weak because a lot of people are independents and the parties are pretty unclear what they stand for. But let's get to what Jacksonian democracy is. So here it is. This is the concept. And this comes from the social contract of the Declaration of Independence. That democracy equals sovereignty. It's not we decide everything, but sovereignty is power. And ultimately, the voters have power. And they begin to call this self-determination. They will decide who will lead them and ultimately what kind of government it will be. And that'll be through the vote. And we come to the eventual thing. Democracy means the people are sovereign. They will decide through the vote, and it's majority rule. And Jackson sincerely believed when he came into office, I have the mandate from the people to rule. Now, the United States does not have majority rule to this day. Because we have, especially back then, but remember, presidents aren't chosen by vote. Judges are not chosen by vote. And the Senate is not apportioned by population. So minority states with small populations have greater representation. We don't have majority rule in the United States. But that was also on purpose. But this became what we kind of thought ourselves. Next, by the end of his presidency, for the most part, there will be universal white male suffrage. Men could vote. And the whole point about that is the common man will decide. You can imagine his opponent said, how dare we have average people make these decisions? And then the distrust of the Eastern establishment, the distrust of this elite in the East who's making the decisions for it. Remember that political map? When I mean the East, when they talk about that, it's the Northeast. It's everything north of Baltimore. So Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. That urban elite. And it was personified by the Bank of the United States. This all-powerful bank that prints currency, that controls the money supply. This beast. And more you'll see it drawn as, here is Jackson fighting the bank. And they draw it as a beast. This monster. And he's defending regular people who are being cheated and misled by the banking industry. And he also came, all right, he actually called it the spoil system. Patronage is giving of government jobs. And back then, there weren't as many federal jobs as today, but every government job, that person can be hired or fired by the president. Patronage is giving the jobs. And what Jackson said is, the people voted for Democrats, so we should give jobs to Democrats. The will of the people. And it's not that he replaced workers. By the way, the most important government jobs were tax collectors and the post office man. Beginning in the 1880s, with beginning in the 1880s, they would change that to make it a professional civil service, where most government jobs, you cannot be fired by political will. And that's state and federal would do that. But he said that was the will of the people. And there's a logic to it. If the people want supporters of Jackson, shouldn't they be the ones running the government? But the opponents would attack them because they're going to put in cronies or commoners. But the will of the people, this is going to be highly controversial. So put a little star by this. I'm not going to talk about it much again, but this was his idea of democracy. If the people vote for Democrats, the Democrats should be in government. Period. He didn't fire any more than other presidents before or since. It's not like he did that. He just said it. Next, the beginnings of a new way to pick political nominees. Party convention would pick nominees, not party elites, to pick nominees for president. The very first party to do this was a relatively minor third party called the Anti-Mason Party. There was a party, very small party, that believed that the Freemasons, a secret society that many of the first presidents were part of, were a cabal to take over and run the country. This secret society. And the Masons did have a lot of influence. There were Masonic symbols all over the Capitol. There's Masonic symbols. If you have a dollar bill and ever wonder what that pyramid was, that's a Masonic symbol. The Masons were really big in Helena. And the Masons have ties, as they saw, to Middle Eastern culture. If you ever wonder why the Civic Center looks the way it does, it was an old Masonic hall. But party conventions. So before, it was elites, as in elected members of the House and Senate would get together and pick who will run for office. Here, we'll get representatives from all the different states and come to a common location, and then they will vote who will run for president and who will run for president for the new party, the Democrats, and the new party, the Whigs. And then states would do it for governor, states would do it for the members of the House and the Senate. And this is the way it would be done for presidents. Party conventions, the Democrats all the way through 1970. The last one would be 68, I'm sorry. The Republicans, 1972. So in my lifetime, it switched. And it switched to what we have now, which is the system where primaries, where voters, Democrats or Republicans will pick voters. This was seen as very democratic. I can't decide which is better. And then that's why they're going to be called the Democrats, because they're the party that represents the democracy. So this is the Democratic Party. By the way, have you ever heard the Democratic Party called Democrat? The Democrat Party? That was and it's been very effective for Republicans to try to attack Democrats. Because you can say Democrat, rat. And people now say it, which it's like really bad grammar. But they were mostly farmers and Westerners. They were immigrants, Catholic immigrants especially, wage workers. Those who believed in the separation of state and church and state. Separation of church and state. In fact, a big issue for Jackson was we're going to have mail delivery on Sundays because we are a secular country. And this was a big fight. But a lot of Catholic immigrants joined it, and the nativists then would be anti-democratic. And this is the beginnings of it. Did they really have an economic policy? Not really. But the anti-Jackson elites would be huge. And this is the mocking to the victor goes the spoils. The number one thing is they hated democracy. They feared it. This is the same people that didn't want democracy. The elites wrote the Declaration of Independence. They wanted to conserve their power. By definition, you would call them more conservative in this element. Now, remember what I told you. The more democratic is what they would call liberal, but it doesn't mean you support like other liberal policies, or conservatives might be against democracy, might support more liberal things. It's complex. But they feared it. They called it either king mob or king numbers. And king numbers is my favorite way to view the way the elites look at democracy. It's like, it doesn't matter what you say, all that matters is you have the greater number of votes. All you need is a greater number of votes and then you can operate like a king. And that's why they came up with king numbers. They hated the democracy. They fought it and fought it and fought democracy. But eventually they would be to the point where they had to accept it. But if you can't beat them, fool them. They called Democrats radicals. You're going to radically change society. You're going to take from the wealthy and give to the poor. Have a more fair, equitable pay system. Maybe break up or have more control over the capital. And they also said that Jackson was a demagogue. A demagogue is somebody who plays on people's fears. If you wrote down demagogue and didn't know what that stood for, and then you did not write that they played on people's fears, that is what we call bad notes. You are responsible to add that, to make sure you know that demagogue means to play on people's fear. So that leads to one of the greatest words in history. If you, the action of playing on someone's fears, it's called demagoguery. You got to admit, that's a pretty good word, demagoguery. And, by the way, Jackson did play on people's fears. They're going to take your money, they're going to put you in debt, they're going to make you a wage slave. But by calling Jackson a king and a tyrant, aren't they demagogues too? Fear is a very effective political weapon. Of course, it might lead to really bad outcomes. They also said this spoils system was just a way to give political hacks and supporters of Jackson or incompetent commoners into office. And they begin to call it the cult of mediocrity. To put in a bunch of yes men for Jackson who are not really competent workers. And by the way, by saying this, this kind of fits right into the Jacksonian argument. You just want elites to run everything. But there's an element of truth there. And then the continuous godless Democrats. There are a bunch of godless Democrats who are supporting Catholic faith. They want to deliver mail on Sunday. The country is becoming significantly more religious because of the Industrial Revolution and all the changes because of that. And the Democrats did not adapt. Eventually, the Democrats would surrender and mail delivery would not happen on Sunday. And so they became known as the Whigs. And so these are the new capitalists and the new bankers of the North. But with a very weird alliance with Southern plantation owners. And a lot of the new churches coming out of the Second Great Awakening would also become Whigs. So this weird alliance of the elite. And they really tried to convince people who might not have been capitalists that someday you could be a capitalist. Someday you can be rich if you support our policies. You can have the great life that we have, or you think we have, if you support our policies. Do you remember that term? Those terms I gave you. The Democrats more and more believed that capitalism was creating what? What did I call that where workers felt trapped and they could not get out? They lost their freedom. What was that called? Which you will have to write an essay on Friday. What was that called? Where workers felt trapped. They felt left out of capitalism. What was that called? You will have to know. I'll tell you right now, you're on the wrong path. They felt left out. They felt as though, this is what Democrats thought. They felt as though they were left out. The system was leaving them behind. They had no freedom. They couldn't leave their job because their pay was so low. Their virtual, or they lost their freedoms down there. Different views of capitalism. Well, law-centered capitalism is what the Whigs want. Who felt left out of the system? It was right before I talked about labor unions. They felt left out. Wage slavery. Very good. Wage slavery. Whigs said, they told workers, you're not slaves. You can do anything you want in the system. You're not a slave, you're what? What was the other one? Boy, you're really going to have to look at this because there will be an essay on this. What was that called? Now, Brady just put a mark by it, but didn't answer the question.
What do you mean? I wasn't really listening. I was trying to find more just as my notes.
You're not really a slave in the system. You have all this opportunity. You have initiative and creativity and opportunity. And you just put a mark by it, but that was still don't happen. What was that called? Yes, free labor. So make sure you have that. Free labor, wage slavery. The Whigs pushed that idea. And so here's Jackson, a very stylized picture on his ride. And by the end of his presidency, he could almost take a train the whole way. That's how much things had changed. Riding the carriage on his way, stopping at a tavern. This is, of course, very stylized. And his inauguration was unlike any other inauguration in history. They opened up the executive mansion that had just been reopened a few years earlier after it was burnt by the British. They opened it up to everybody. And since it was whitewashed to cover some of the scorch marks, it will soon be called the White House. And all these commoners came. Regular people came to celebrate their president coming into office. And they opened the doors of the executive mansion and let them run free. And they had barrels and barrels of hard cider and whiskey all over for them to drink. And in the front foyer, and by the way, here it shows the kind of the wildness of this, they had a big block of, well, let's be clear. What represents democracy? Cheese. They had a massive block of cheese in the front foyer of the White House, the executive mansion, and people were cutting out hunks of this cheese, walking around, cheering Jackson, climbing through windows. I mean, this is like the people's president is in office. But you can imagine how the elites took this. Look at these bunch of uncouth commoners, which of course Jackson supporters would say, see, they hate us because we're normal people. But as we all know, cheese represents democracy. Don't forget that. That I can't emphasize enough. In fact, on this day, I even have cheese in my lunch because that represents democracy. How does it represent democracy? How do you make cheese? Have you ever made cheese at home? You know how you make cheese? You get the stomach of an ungulate, so some kind of animal like a cow or a goat or a sheep, and you put the milk in, and something about the enzymes in the stomach will, as the cheese begins to spoil, will get it to solidify, make curd, and eventually cheese.
I thought it was just like milk and sits out.
Then it becomes just spoiled milk. You have to have it mixed with some kind of enzyme. So cheese requires the stomach of an animal.
So how would they make a big block like that?
Huh?
How would they, or did they like?
Well, you start the process going, then when you get the curds, then you combine it and then once you get the curds, which is this kind of gooey stuff, then you can mix it all together and make a big block. Now, despite that, I got to be honest. First time I heard that, I was like, oh, I love cheese. Right? I don't trust anybody who doesn't like cheese. And I don't like American cheese. I don't like petroleum-based cheese products. But anyways, moving on. Look how happy they are. Democracy. And his whole goal would be to protect the common man. And the three big issues of his presidency, all three were geared to his vision of the common man. Indian removal. And I'll have to explain this in more detail. But to open up land for common white men. Yes, I know. It's horrifically racist and it's horrible. So I'm not defending it, but I'm trying to let you know that this is the way they looked at it. We're opening up land for commoners. nullification crisis. And or Southerners threatened civil war to protect slavery. And then the war against the bank to protect small people, small debtors against the bank. All right, so tomorrow I'm going to go on around 9. Same deal as before. I got to do it on Teams. Would you rather me do it on Teams? Because I can't have to comment or just broadcast straight on YouTube. Or just switch it over. The thing about it is that I can't have comments on YouTube. That's a tough decision.
It doesn't. I have a call at 9 anyway, so.
You have a call?
Yeah.
With whom?
Stitch for scriptures. So I usually don't watch it live. I'll just watch it on YouTube after. So when you say like Jacksonian era, is that like basically like how you say Trump administration? Is that like
Not quite, but this era, it's really starting about 1820 all the way to about 1840.
so it's
Even
not,
when he's outside of presidency.
okay, so it's like still in effect when he's outside.
It's basically, you know, his presidency will dominate or seem to personify the changing culture of society. Where the Trump administration, for example, just be vice president. Even though he will probably have influence, I don't know.
Read and study in my hall.
I expect more of you. I want you to get every question right and then add your own questions. We have a test this week, you know. It's probably got to be Friday. I was hoping to get done, but everything takes a little bit longer. We had to go through a couple things first period, and that slowed me down. We can do it today and just wing it. Huh?
I'm supposed to babysit on Thursday. So, oh.
Is it better than on Friday? Let's do it Friday.
Yeah, because I'm like, I don't want to go and try to take a test with a 9-month-old. That might be
I don't want the 9-month-old telling me all the answers.
Yeah, 9-month-old. All the answers.
Quick, do it right now. I think I'm going to change your regulatory law. Let's get on back to you. Sound good? And you know we have a test. You excited? I can tell. Yeah, I think it'll be fine.
Okay.
And it'll be the same deal. You'll log on. No passes? We're stuck here? All right, good. My computer is now. You're gonna use such cheap components.